Ever since, the domain of postcolonial studies has been grappling with a nexus of resistant and resilient voices. Literature has been undergoing phenomenal transformations. Pluralities are celebrated, centers have become peripheral, and margins have become mainstream. In short, trans is in. And herein lies the significance of the conduct of this colloquium. When colonialism exists in the post-colonial period, in many forms of neo-colonialism, just as our head pointed out, when you have so many unfortunate incidents happening in our country, he have received this expert in the field of post-colonial studies, Professor Betty Joseph from Rice University, Texas. Dear audience, it's about time to listen to and decipher the post-colonial discourses in the digital age. Welcome, ma'am, for the guest lecture.
Good morning. First of all, I just want to say I didn't expect this kind of a beautiful setting. It's a beautiful campus, and I didn't expect this kind of a formal and generous welcome. I thought I would be talking to 20 students and 5 teachers. So I'm very touched, I'm very honored. And it is especially delightful to have this wonderful surprise of meeting Dr. Pius, whose work I have read over the years. And one of the reasons I decided to spend my sabbatical of 6 months in Kerala was I said, I'm going to go and meet Dr. Pius and ask him to give me a reading list. But I called up Dr. Pius and he said, well, I've got a job for you. I want you to give a talk here, I want you to give a talk here, and I want you to give a talk here. So I have to do this before I get my reading list from him. So I know that's the bargain. I want to thank Dr. Nibu for being the person who organized this and running through several topics till we came to something that we thought would work well for a session like this, and also Professor Thomas for inviting me, and for Dr. Anita for being the coordinator, and everyone else who has helped put this together. So thank you very much. I'm going to try and cut this talk because the more time I take to talk, the less we will have for discussion. So if at some point it feels a little rushed, I hope you will understand that this is a way for me to save time. When Dr. Nibu was running topics by me, I think the first thing he mentioned was, how about saying something about the relevance of postcolonial studies in a digital age? Now, when someone tells me to talk about the relevance of something, it usually means that that topic has become kind of irrelevant, which is why you now have to make an argument for it. So I was actually very relieved when the topic changed to something like deciphering postcolonial voices in a digital age. Now, this is a little off field for me because in the last 10 or 15 years, as Dr. Pius mentioned, I was more interested in studying 18th century and 17th century Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment, history of colonialism, colonial archives, etc. So my work was more historical, but I've always been interested in thinking about the history of capitalism, you know, from the 18th century, which is when it began to kind of take root in Britain, and you had the emergence of a middle class for which the novel, the English novel, became like the primary source of cultural values, to something like globalization, which, as Dr. Pius reminded us, is only one of many globalizations. So it is always important, if you have some sympathy for Marxist theory, then one is that one should think about history very seriously, that this globalization is one of many, and there are archaic globalizations, such as the ones that Dr. Pius mentioned, which had different technologies. Writing is a technology, oral narratives is a technology, carrying messages is a technology, so is the digital age. It is a different kind of technology. But ships and boats and pedestrian paths, the Silk Road, these are all modes of transportation. They may have taken longer times, and one of the fascinating things for me was when the British Empire was being consolidated and before the steamships came, it would take 8 to 9 months for instructions from the East India Company headquarters in London to come to a factory like the one that they called Anjengo, which is actually Anjitenga, which is near Kollam. And I mean, what is the use of instructions when they take 9 months? Because the people who've had to act have already acted, right? So I was always fascinated by the way in which information is still media. There is something about the transporting of messages that has its own logic, where the message or the information is in some sense obsolete by the time it arrives. So in a way, digital media today has that function too, when we notice this, when much of the information that comes through is often useless. But there is a different kind of function that it still has, especially emotional function, rousing people's anger, hatred, etc. So I think this is one of the jobs, new tasks for the humanities. This is how we make the humanities relevant, by saying this is also part of what we need to understand, and the humanists are the only people who have the tools to really understand this. Okay? So one of the lessons that literary theory teaches us is that all questions and topics are themselves already responses to other existing questions. So the title of the talk brings up the question of deciphering. We know that literature is coded language, most often so in symbolic poetry, and most obviously in allegorical texts or in expressive styles like irony, where you say one thing, but you actually mean something else. That's coding, right? But literature is also coded in a very fundamental sense. Literature talks about the world while reminding us that what it is saying is not true. That never happened, right? Novels, poetry, etc. fabricate a reality. They are not. If they did not fabricate a reality, literature would be history, or literature would be journalism, right? We know that it's not history and it's not journalism. So part of what we really need to, I think, have faith in is there is something really fundamental about that act of coding, okay? It is that moment when human beings go and do a cave painting, and it is a tremendous shift in human cognitive function, where you go and do a cave painting of the ancient man goes and does a cave painting showing a hunt. Because the ancient man is not saying, look, here's dinner, right? That would be a purely communicative, a pragmatic function. The cave painting is an attempt to represent something that has already happened with not a very pragmatic view in mind, okay? It's like, I always like to tell my students, it's like play, right? When two animals are, playing with each other, one dog chases the other one, then it pretends to bite the person, then it barks, and then it runs the other way, etc. We have to understand there's something really fundamental and higher level about that activity. Because what one dog is telling the other dog is, I'm biting you, but I'm not really biting you. I'm chasing you, but I'm not really chasing you. I'm barking at you, but I'm not really trying to fight with you. And why don't we think about literature as that kind of a coding? I'm telling you something about the world, about human beings, but it is not really true, right? So I think there's a scientific argument that we should also insist on, that this is a fundamental activity of the human brain about cognition, and to just say that it is somehow something divorced from science or higher levels of understanding is not really true. That literature is a really important kind of cognitive function. Another way to pose the question of deciphering would be, in the digital age, would be to ask, what happens to literature and its artistic lie when people today cannot differentiate between true and fake news on the internet? And we should talk about this at some point. Does the study of literature actually help one become a more judicious processor of information today? Or we could go further and ask, does digital media have an imperial bent? While technology seems neutral, is it creating a level playing field, or is it creating a further economic divide between the haves and the have-nots? We also know that the use of English on the World Wide Web is now endangering the sustainability of minority languages in the global South. But in a positive sense, digitization enables a serious and sustained study of postcolonial literature. It makes more material available to more students in resource-poor areas of the world. But I think despite all the positive and the negative aspects of digital media, it is still useful to ask whether, as a field itself, postcolonial studies, whether some of the concepts that have been fundamental to it have actually needed some kind of revisioning or rethinking. Because learning doesn't take place in a vacuum. How we do postcolonial studies today has to be affected by the changing circumstances of the world around us. And one of the things that is changing is what we call globalization, right? In a globalizing world, do some of the fundamental meanings or meta-geographies of colonial studies actually hold anymore? So I have divided my talk today into 3 parts, which would be the next slide. One is to think about the field transitions of colonial and postcolonial studies, and I've called them meta-geographies 1, 2, and 3. 1 and 2 are the ones that were kind of fundamental to colonial and postcolonial studies in the 1980s in the field of literary studies. I mean, I'm not saying that we were not studying Indian writing in English or African writing in English. In fact, I took seminars on those topics while I was in JNU, so this is not new. But there's a particular kind of theoretical framing that I think began in the 1980s. So I think that's what I call meta-geographies 1 and 2. Meta-geography 3 is what we would now call globalization. And part of what I'm trying to think through today with you is how globalization has also changed how we identify what exactly is postcolonial writing. For example, our diasporic writers, people of Indian origin who've never lived in India, why would they be postcolonial writers when they have become minority writers in the United States, for example? And this is not simply about, I think, making distinctions or identity talk. I think it fundamentally is reflected in the kind of writing they do. So one of the things I will do in the second part of the talk is to show you a couple of examples. And I took the risk of talking about people who I'm actually just reading. So I just finished reading Abraham Verghese's new novel called The Covenant of Water, set in Kerala. And I am just halfway through, I haven't even finished a translation of S. Harish's Misha, which is translated as mustache. But I just thought those 2 novels just raise interesting questions that might be useful for us today. And the last section is where I hope we have a broader discussion of the nature of the kind that Nibu was pointing to, where we talk about the relevance of what we do in an age where it doesn't seem really important, or where there is less and less institutional and monetary support for the kind of work you do. But I want to draw on examples from the US because we are facing the same problems there. The numbers of students who actually do BA level degrees in English have gone down, and there is a lot of focus on STEM disciplines, on technology, and we are thinking the same kinds of, we are challenged the same way that you are here, of making an argument for why this work is important now more than ever in a digital age. So that's a kind of a more general topic, okay? So I'm going to, be a little rushed because I would like to finish in about 20, 25 minutes if possible. Next slide, please. Yeah. So this is Metageography 1, and you know this. This is a paragraph from Conrad's personal record where he talks about how in 1868, when he was 9 years old, he was looking at a map of Africa and putting his finger on the blank space. And the blank space is, visible in the second close-up of the map. And it's not very clear, but right by the equator, you have a little bit that says unknown interior, right? This is the map, and this is the map that was probably, it's 1859, made a few years before Conrad was looking at a map. It's possible that this is the map that he was looking at. And he says, when I grow up, I shall go there. And that you could, if a certain area was unknown to the European, it simply became unknown interior, right? And this is the image that then becomes the core of his most famous work, A Heart of Darkness, written in 1899. For those of you who are familiar with the work, it is one of the most powerful versions of the metageography that rendered the entire continent of Africa into an empty void with no human beings, no culture, no history. Africa became a blank darkness, a sort of negative screen on which Europe then projected its own civilizational fears and prehistoric past. The first generation of post-colonial African writers like Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o wrote fiction that represented the social life of their people. Their fiction was an intellectual attempt to bring this void back to life, to show that village life, however simple compared to the complexities of European urban settings, that village life has cultural change, historical change, and collective change, and that resistance to colonialism was an important part of African colonial reality. Here, social realism seemed an appropriate response to the work of someone like Conrad, rather than the magical, fabulous, and allegorical tales that may have been closer to the storytelling traditions of the writer's own cultures, writers like the Kenyan writer Wa Thiong'o and the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe. This is the second metageography, also fundamental to postcolonial studies. This is the geography that Edward Said takes on in his 1978 source book, Orientalism, right? And this is not processing, the world is not being processed as an empty world, because South and Asia and the Middle East are not sparsely populated. You can't simply say this is an empty world. So what you then do is you try and subordinate the culture in some way that makes it inferior or oppositional to the West in some way. And not all of this was negative. For example, you could say the East is more spiritual. Great, that's great. But in a time when science is being privileged or seen as rational, to be spiritual is no big deal, right? So you could have things that sound like they look good, but sound like they feel positive, but as Edward Said would argue, there were forms of flexible superiority. They still gave the advantage to the left side of the screen. So you have the Occident and the Orient. And the other thing about the Orient is, when you called someone an Oriental man, you did not, or it was like calling something an Oriental carpet. You could have something from Iran, you could have something from China, you could have something from Kashmir, you could have something from Persia. It didn't matter, it was all the same. That there was no attempt to make distinctions, cultural, linguistic, religious. It was like there was some kind of a mentality that everyone had that was the Orient. And to some extent, we do a bit of that when we say something is Western. I mean, there is really nothing called Western except in opposition to something that we think is not us, right? So we do these kinds of meta-geographies on our behalf too, but this was a fundamental one that was important for the way in which India, Pakistan, China, Japan, the Middle East was seen as relating, the relationship through which they were constructed in relation to the West. Now the third one, this is a more recent map employing newer techniques. It's a 3D network visualization from 1993. It's Terry Harpol's analysis Terry Harpold has analyzed this visual, and I'm going to quote him because he actually does a better job explaining what is going on here. Quote, "The arcs between the countries indicate the flow of network traffic, with the higher and redder arcs indicating the larger flows. One of the most striking traits of this image is its dissymmetry. The greater parts of the arcs and glyphs are traced on the upper left field, roughly north and west in relation to the equator and Greenwich meridian. Pinning the origins of the arcs, the capitals of countries, underrepresents the actual geographical distribution of traffic. But it's clear that apart from a few arcs converging in Pretoria, South Africa, there is nothing much going in or coming out of Africa in early 1993. And Terry Harpol's argument is, much has changed since 1993, but uneven distribution will be present every time there is infrastructural change. Many visualizations of global networks today create a fake contemporary. They often suggest that we are all connected in a borderless digital world. There are no more national boundaries, everyone is moving around, and everyone is now on a level playing field. We know this is not true. Take, for instance, all the TV antennas that may be streaming Netflix and HBO and CNN to houses in Shillong and Kochi. But the houses in Houston, where I live, are not streaming NDTV News or Shalom TV or Kairali. And my mother is actually very upset at this. She says, why don't you get Houston and Shalom goodness So she is very upset that the stuff is not going the other way around. Yeah. So I tell her it's all about uneven globalization. Yeah. Though the truth is, if you try hard enough, you will actually find them. Next slide, please. In this figure, the internet traffic looks more like beacons in the night than, say, undersea cables, satellite relays, or fiber optic cables. Unlike the previous image, this one includes national borders and solid hues, and they represent the intensity of traffic to and from each nation. Now, the point that Harpol makes is that you don't differentiate. These are all visuals that are giving us globalization and the digital media. But all these are meta-geographies that hide certain things. They always hide unevenness. So even when you look at Australia, even when you look, they most often the arcs are only going into particular cities. So you don't get a sense of how uneven, for example, broadband might be in the US. And this is a big problem. There are parts of rural US that still have really bad connectivity. But the point is that all these visuals always hide a certain kind of unevenness. And what I'm leading to is to show how novels these days, especially those who take on a kind of critical globality, have tried to address these unevenness so we are not kind of blinded by these colorful visualizations of connectivity. And I'm using it kind of as a metaphor. Viewed with an eye to their unacknowledged political valences, these images of the wired world, that is, as Harpole would say, mostly unwired world. In fact, what it shows you is how little the world is wired. They draw on visual discourses of identity and negated identity that, he argues, echo those of the European maps of colonized and colonizable space of nearly a century ago. Nothing much has changed visually since Conrad's map. So you look at Africa there, still dark. It has the countries now lined up, but nothing seems to be happening there except in South Africa. Right. And I'm going to move to the second part of the talk, where we move from the visual aids that map the world of European colonialism, global teletechnologies, to more recent fiction that attempts to capture what I understand to be a critical globality, by which I mean fictional representations of the globalized world that are attentive to the sorts of unevenness of access and mobility that are often hidden in the sorts of dazzling data visualizations we are looking at. I have borrowed the term neutralization from A. Anish, a sociologist who was trained in India and the US and who now teaches at the University of Oregon. Anish has done important work on call centers 10 years ago, and one of his insights was how call centers have become neutral spaces for communications across cultures. Here, neutrality is not homogenization. It doesn't mean that one language and its dominant accent has become the standard for everyone, but rather, as he puts it, it is, quote, an unhinging of accent from places. That means you can't tell where this person is from, right? Or of identities from persons. You can't tell if they might be North Indian, South Indian, etc., or any other kind of markers. And of biological clocks from person. This person may be talking to somebody in a part of the world at 2 o'clock in the morning, but will still say good evening or whatever the time is somewhere else, right? So this is what he means, that your biological clock has been estranged from you too in the call center. It is the creation, he says, of a new differentiation, a form of language constructed as neutral, functioning on a global scale, a new form of English. And part of what I'm trying to say is that we have to attend to these new forms of English that are also emerging in fiction, because when writers try and communicate to different audiences around the world, they're also doing something like the call center is doing. There's a certain kind of neutralization of language, and it's the literary kind of critics who can actually show what is happening to language in these kinds of texts. In my forthcoming book, Empire to Anthropocene, I've pointed out that we can see this sort of neutralization not only at the level of language, but also in the way that literary writing captures location. It seems to me that spaces in the so-called global novels are losing not only a sense of concreteness about their location, but also of time or a historical aura. In other words, places are losing history because the digital world replaces images and objects very quickly and does not respect temporal sequence. What we mean by an archive is a metaphor on the internet. For example, here's an example of how we experience this dislocation of time. There's so much stuff circulating on WhatsApp that feels like it is happening today, is quite recent, till someone points out that's actually an old video, and you must have seen this sometime, but someone will say, oh yeah, that's an old video, it's 5 years old or it's 2 years old. But it doesn't matter, because that video has created a nowness in the way that someone has responded it by saying, Era, look at that, right? So it is a response to this time that has created its own contemporary, but we don't exactly know when these videos were created. This is a kind of confusion that I think is a kind of historical evaporation of kind of historical sequencing that be fundamental to our understanding of the past, the present, and the future, that I think the digital media has succeeded in kind of messing up. Coupled with this is the phenomenon, the consumerist drive that constantly encourages the public to replace things before they are broken, a plan of making things obsolete so we can get the latest. One of the novels I teach is the British writer Hari Kunzru's novel, Transmission. In it, we encounter Arjun, a software engineer who has moved for a job from New Delhi to Seattle in the US. I'm especially interested in this, how this novel converts the so-called space of flows like space into a differentiated or hierarchical space. Okay? And this is the kind of thing that he does. So there is Arjun, in a bus going across the Yamuna bridge, and there's a slum all around him, right? He's thinking of his future. He's just got an interview. He's just, succeeded in interviewing for a job in Seattle. He knows he's going to the US. His mind is already thinking of him in sequences. This is who I'm going to be 2 years from now. I'll have a car, I'll have a girlfriend, I'll have a house, blah, blah, blah. And this is a novel that makes fun of this kind of, a person. This is a kind of a parody. So it says, lost in his inner retail space, he stared blankly out of the window, his eyes barely registering the low roofs of patchwork thatch and blue polythene by the roadside, the ragged children standing under the tangle of illegally strung power lines. And this is now notice what it's doing. High in the sky overhead was a vapor trail of a jet, a commercial flight crossing Indian airspace en route to Singapore. In its first-class compartment sat another traveler, rather more comfortably than Arjun, who was squashed against the damp shoulder of a man in a polyester shirt. And this is the guy who's going to become Arjun's employer, Guy Swift, right? Did Guy Swift sense some occult connection with the boy on the bus 30,000 feet below? Did he perhaps feel a tug, a premonition, the kind of unexplained phenomenon that has as its correlative a shiver or a raising of the hairs on the neck or arms? No, nothing. He was playing Tetris, which is a computer game, on the armrest games console. So this is making fun of this idea that suddenly the digital world has connected everyone. And what he does here is that he takes this abstract space that we call airspace, right? Crucial to globalization. He slices it horizontally into several zones. So in the same narrative frame, we get the contrast between, those who are part of the network but exist at different levels of access and speeds. Up, down, plane, bus, first-class cabin, public transport, and those whose mobility is arrested by internal borders of class and caste, the displaced poor, migrant workers, urban slum dwellers that are visible from Arjun's bus window. And in the US, you would add the undocumented workers who are trying to cross into the US from Mexico. They're all required, they're all necessary, but there's a way in which they are not handled in a humane way. It's always making it seem like people need to be arrested, right, at the border. So borderlessness for some people, closed borders for other people, both these things are fundamental in some way to globalization. Now I want to move to another example, and this one is now trying to think of borderlessness in terms of language, okay? This is, and I've skipped a session because I want to get to the end of this. Here we meet a diasporic writer, Abraham Verghese, who is a Malayali extraction but grew up in Ethiopia. He's actually a medical practitioner. He teaches at the Stanford University Medical School. He attended medical college in India and then moved to the US to complete his training. Along the way, Verghese has become a very successful writer whose books sell to a wide audience. He also attained what is considered the holy grail of writers in the US, an appearance on the Oprah Winfrey Show that made his most recent novel into an instant bestseller. I have just finished reading The Covenant of Water. To me, this novel is a perfect example of the neutralization of language, in which communication across cultures is the goal, and moving effortlessly across linguistic barriers is the experience it wants to give its readers. The sentences you will notice are short with simple syntax. Don't look for complex texture or metaphorical richness in the expression. The style of narration is mostly third person, externalized. At the same time, there's an attempt to create a world that feels singular and unique by pointing the reader to unfamiliar objects and cultural practices. So the first section, the first couple of lines are from page 14. And it's about a little girl who is, I think, 11 or 12 and is about to be married. And her mother says nothing, though she worries that her daughter will dirty her white blouse and munda or the kavani with the faint gold trim. Now, I was very impressed when and I have to say, I enjoyed reading this book. I also went to his reading, which actually was in Houston about 3 months ago. But what was funny to me was there you're sitting with a man whose experience is a lot like yours, you know, from Kerala, but has not really lived there, traveled all around, ended up in the US, etc. But I didn't feel he was talking, this novel was written for me. That is what I'm trying to describe. And the first part I would say, okay, good, the novel is written for me. He's not going to translate Munda Kavani, he's going to make the reader, but he's put them in italicized, you know, so that he has put them in as foreign words in an English novel. But then you go to the next page and then there is this. The bride shivers even though it is sultry. She isn't used to wearing a chatta and munda. From this day on, no more long skirt and colored blouse. She'll dress like her mother and aunt in this uniform of every married woman in the St. Thomas Christian world. White is its only color. The mund is like a man's, but tied more elaborately, the free edge pleated and folded over itself 3 times, then tucked into a fantail to conceal the shape of the wearer's bottom. I didn't know that. Concealment is also the goal of the shapeless, short-sleeved V-neck blouse, the white chatta, etc. This is where he's now playing, you know, ethnographer, anthropologist, right? He's, in case the reader didn't get what a munda or a kavani was, he has to wait 1 page and then translate the whole thing for them, right? This is what I mean, that there is no effort made to make the reader do a little work. Everything has to be delivered to them in a way that is like Starbucks coffee all over the world. You don't have to feel texture where something is difficult or something is foreign. Everything is somehow translated. So when I started reading Misha in translation, why? Because one of the prices you pay for exactly the kind of thing that Dr. Pius talked about, you gain a lot of experience moving around the world, is that my reading and writing in Malayalam is very rudimentary because I never went to school and studied it. So I'm reading it in translation. But I just wanted to show you in contrast how a good translator has thought about this issue. Right. The next slide, please. The novel in question is Harish's Misha, now available in Jayashree Kalatal's excellent translation as Mustache. But here, even though Misha aims to reach a larger audience by virtue of its translation and does so by offering a world that in its historical setting seems untouched by globalization, globalization is the central preoccupation of the novel. This is what I found fascinating. When you start reading it, you think, oh, this is some kind of beautifully magical, realistic depiction of a Kutanad that is no longer existent. And suddenly, the novel just breaks the frame, and the narrator says, you know what, my child is watching cartoons and playing computer games all day. And that's there in the novel. And suddenly the novel itself becomes a kind of resistance against this kind of neutralization of culture. That is what I found interesting, that in a way, Abraham Verghese's novel is also a novel written in the times of globalization, but it doesn't make it apparent. This one actually makes that a central kind of point within it. This is clear in the very pre-structuring of the novel, that globalization is a central preoccupation of the novel. Indeed, the loss of a world, semi-feudal, whatever you want to call it, Kutanad, is not mourned nostalgically, but rather ecologically and cognitively. What has the Bandh, the Tanir Mukam Bandh, I think, what that has done to the ecology of Kutanad at the same time was also what gave it its economic prosperity, makes this a novel that is much ahead of its time in the sense that it is also addressing precisely the sorts of new questions that Nibu was talking about ecology, ecological catastrophe, environmentalism, etc. The novel's narrator is from our own contemporary time and senses a crisis in the way the new generation has lost the requisite sensory tools for processing an older world and its stories. Harish's novel seems to be a response to this crisis and thus stands as both a counterforce to the culture of globalization and a solution for the conditions of historical amnesia. More stories, says Harish. We need stories that will adopt new formats and compete with cartoons and, computer games, I guess. For Harish, the impending loss of a world is not the result of colonialism, but rather of globalization. Those of you who are familiar with the novel know that Misha's narrator tells a story of a Dalit character, Vavachan. The setting is Kutanad, rife with supernatural, non-human, and magical elements. But the narrative structure of the novel fashions itself as a bedtime story told by the narrator to his young son. And this is a trick that really involves the audience itself into the making of the story. The very pretext for the story is a loss of cultural difference in the digital age. While the narrator's son, like most children, pesters his father for a story at bedtime, the narrator is faced with a crisis. How many stories do we know, he asks, that we can narrate to children in a way that captures their interest? The narrator tries to tell his sons stories remembered from the Panchatantram, Arabian Nights, and the Katta Sarit Sagaram, but he can only remember a handful, and when he makes some up on the spot, the son falls asleep angry and disappointed with the attempt. The narrator soon watches the boy's interest wane and be replaced by computer games and cartoons that fill his head with a void. And I think this idea of filling your head with a void is actually much more complex than it sounds, because it suggests that cartoons are images that have no real reference to the world. They are pure simulacra. So it is not like you are actually learning anything that is in some way really connected to the world, however cute, cartoons are in some way. So there are two things I noticed when I started reading Misha in the English translation. One is that the translator's postcolonial consciousness makes her attentive to the way in which even Indian languages may subjugate elements of minority discourse. Now, Jayashree Kalatal lives in London. I I think I don't know I don't remember what her profession is, but she's not, I mean, she has, I think she's a social worker, she has a different profession, she's not a full-time writer. But she said something interesting in this joint interview with Harish and the translator. She says, we think of Kerala as a small geographical area with a uniform culture and language, but as a native speaker of upper caste Malayalam from the hilly parts of Malabar, I had to negotiate in Malayalam itself several cultural and linguistic imaginaries to translate a book like Mustache. As a migrant writer living in the colonizer's country, I'm constantly faced with the demands to explain myself, to italicize my otherness. It is a demand I have learned to resist. So I think it's interesting that it is her post-colonial consciousness living as an Indian in London that made her also conscious that the Malayalam she uses is in some way only one of the many Malayalams in this novel. And so she had to really negotiate the texture of that. So this is just the opening of the book. And I just want you to notice the texture and the contrast between the texture of a novel like this and Abraham Verghes's, which is written for a much broader audience. And I'm not saying people shouldn't write for broader audiences, but you pay a price, is what I'm saying. And one of the tasks we have as people who are trained to notice such details in language is to understand what is happening culturally when the very modes of ways in which we express ourselves and talk are also data that can be analyzed in some way. So next slide, please. This is the beginning of the first paragraph of the novel. Notice that there is no italicization, right? Whether it is Makaram or Kumbam or Inam Pichi, that none of these words are italicized. There is no attempt to translate what a Vaniyan folk is, what Kanyi is, etc. And I looked on the other pages to see Kanyi, rice porridge. No, it's not there. So I think one of the things we understand is if we live in a digital age, writers also are taking a chance that if people don't understand what these words are, they should go and look it up on the internet, right? I mean, you need to make the reader learn too. And in that sense, this is a novel that I think is trying to resist certain kinds of trends rather than spoon-feeding them everything. So I just wanted to show you these two examples as a way of thinking about how the very texture of language is also giving us really important things about globalization, even if globalization is not thematically in these novels, you know, right up in front and center. So I'm going to move to the final part of this talk. And I've chosen as the segue a quote from the Supreme Court judgment against a petition to ban Harish's book in 2018. And the judgment was delivered on September 5th by these justices, Deepak Mehra, Kanvilkar, and D.Y. Chandrachud. Sorry, I misspelled Chandrachud there. And there were these many paragraphs. I think it's really worth reading. There's only about 5 or 6 pages, but how much of it shows a certain kind of, you know, I mean, the learnedness of some of these justices. I mean, they quote people like Oscar Wilde, and this one especially is, you know, kind of stands out. Literature can act as a medium to connect to readers only when creativity is not choked or smothered. The free flow of the stream of creativity knows no bounds and imagination brooks no limits. A writer or an artist or any person in the creative sphere has to think in an unfettered way, free from the shackles that may hinder his musings and ruminations. The writers possess the freedom to express their views and imagination, and readers to enjoy the freedom to perceive and imagine from their own viewpoint. Sans imagination, the thinking process is conditioned. This is the political importance of literature, enshrined in most constitutions, as a site where one can say anything. Literature is the ultimate icon of the freedom of expression, and no civil society that wishes to protect individual freedoms would want to censor its artists, poets, and writers in a public way. If they do it without drawing a lot of attention. But this seems to be a fundamental kind of function that it becomes a litmus test. Do you censor your writers? How free is your society? However, I also found interesting this aside made by one of the justices during the hearing that led to this judgment. Justice Chandrachud addressed this remark to the advocate representing the petitioner who asked to have the book banned. So this is what the justice said. Quote, "You're giving undue importance to this kind of stuff. In the age of the internet, you're making this an issue. It is best forgotten." Now this is very interesting because a lot of newspaper reports give us that line, but I could not find a more detailed context to find out what was said before and after this statement. What did the justice mean? Did he mean that the petitioner should worry more about all the crap that is circulating on the internet, pornography, stereotypes, sexual harassment that mess with people's minds, rather than worrying about one sexist remark made about women going to a temple by a sexist character in a novel? A novel is not true after all, right? Or was the justice alluding to the fact that there is so much crowdsourcing of outrage, affective rather than rational debate about small things that snowball into bigger things? But we don't need Justice Chandrachud to really tell us that the internet has become a primary actor in galvanizing nationalist and religious outrage and even ethnic and racial hatreds, because it does not allow the traditional form of debate through which opinions can be changed through interaction. We don't change our minds on the internet. You make up your mind and then you find the people who support that, right? That's how it works. It's not about having an argument or a debate and saying, you know what, I changed my mind. That's the problem with what is happening in terms of political debate. In any case, the distinction the justice makes between the experience of reading the imaginative fabrication of literature and that of reading fake news items and doctored images is a valuable one, because it prompts us to ask, and I've been thinking seriously about this question, do people who show an inability to tell the difference between fake and real on the internet, does it have something to do with the lack of a humanistic education, right? Or are we just people who think that everything is fiction? Or is it because you have not actually been taught to read literature that you cannot actually tell the difference? So this is a serious question for me. And now to some conclusions. We know that humanistic learning generally and literary learning in particular is not progressive. What do I mean? By this I mean that we don't stop learning something just because it gets old. In the sciences, new paradigms and their theories replace old ones, and people don't exactly go back to study what they believe are obsolete theories. They keep up with the trends. But this does not mean that we shouldn't keep up too. As the critic David Goldberg has indicated, the humanities translate the human to ourselves, what it is to be, what it means and is meant to be, and what it ought to be human. Thus, literature has an important role in laying bare the human condition of the past, present, and future, exploring beyond traditional disciplines of languages, literature, philosophy, and history, individual and collective identification in changing conditions as revealed in text, practices, values. To this, we have no alternative now but to add one more item, that we need to think about textuality more broadly and extend our reach onto other venues and media, such as the internet, computer games, television, radio, advertising. All these are now essential, objects of study for the humanities. On the other hand, we don't need to shirk from what we call value-added arguments, and we are trying to think about this in the US. We should not be shy about saying something like the humanities are needed for global competitiveness. Students without sufficient language knowledge and foreign culture familiarity cannot compete. Students without appropriate analytic, writing, and oral skills that a humanities education can provide will be ill-prepared for an increasingly globalized world with a competitive workforce. At my university, we often have engineers, medical students, and scientists of various tribes who will also do a BA in English with their science degrees for this very reason, to be more competitive. For us as teachers, this also means embracing different formats of learning and demonstration. So we diversify the skills that we give our students. It's not simply about writing term papers and doing tests anymore. We may have to go beyond the dissertation monograph and expand the possible forms that the doctoral dissertation might take. We may have to embrace more flexible options, such as a collection of essays, a digital project, a collection of different genres of scholarly writing, public scholarship, a documentary, a translation or textual edition, or a project in comics mode, etc. Likewise, colleagues of mine have experimented with alternatives to the seminar paper, including collaborative essays, a grant application. When funding has become so hard, why don't we teach our students how to do a grant application? Because that is a really important form of writing that will be useful for them, not just during their educational career, but also in other careers to come, right? Or a creative portfolio, a lecture for an undergraduate survey class. So teaching can also become a creative kind of assignment where you design syllabi, you design a reading list or a lesson plan, etc. A mapping project, a blog edited into a publishable piece. For those people who do things on the internet, maybe they can work with some of those and make them into much more publishable pieces. So we have to also learn how to give our students different skills, but also to use the skills that they have developed on their own as young people who are savvy about using media tools, to bring them back into the classroom and find ways to kind of mesh them with the assignments they're doing in class. So all of this may seem idealistic when many of our students expect us, their teachers, to prepare them to get work and start their careers, and often in fields that are not directly related to English literature. Only a very small number of you will end up going on to teach English literature. Many of you will find satisfaction doing other kinds of jobs in your lives. We have a responsibility there too. We cannot slide hopelessly into the idea that everything is going to become online education. It doesn't really matter what we do, face to face with students, etc. We have to continue to impress the institutional role of the humanities and how its social and civic relevance is crucially needed now more than ever for its role in shaping a globally oriented, well-rounded, well-informed, well-educated citizenry capable of independent critical thinking and analysis that may improve the function of a true democratic society. We have to proceed with a long-term view, the notion that is the familiarity with different and alternative ways of being in the world throughout history, which a humanities education can provide, that will make us more tolerant. And some of the most formidable challenges facing us today, like catastrophic climate change, that may be scientifically understood, but actually not very persuasively, considering the number of people who actually still deny that something like climate change is happening. But to address the ethical nature of human responsibility to future generations requires a sort of engagement with otherness and others that the study of literature engenders in much more effective ways. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Beginning with that elementary question of literature and humanities, as it's up to the reader to make of it, and wrapping up with that wonderful thought on the revival and relevance of deciphering and embracing pluralities. It was an effortless travel of narratives of many lexicons and the interface between literature and technology. Thanks a lot, ma'am, for the gift of your time and of your knowledge. And now after that active listening, it's time for the audience to engage in some active participation. And dear students, please seize the chance, raise questions, make your statements, get clarifications. The floor is open to you.
How is the relationship between corruption and silence in postmodern writing?
Corruption and silence. So give me a little more about what you were thinking about. Did you have like a particular novel in mind?
In most postmodern writing, we can see that we are making the Western by others. So what's the main purpose which is portrayed? Those people are corrupted and those people are silenced in post-colonial writings.
So, if you're asking whether some people are represented as corrupted, but you don't think they are corrupted, or do you actually think they are corrupted?
I think they are corrupted.
They are corrupted. And you think postmodern writing lets them off the hook, doesn't have a moral viewpoint on these things?
Yes, in most postmodern writings, we can see that most of them are corrupted and silenced.
But you know, if somebody is corrupted, I would rather that the person be silent, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So is the problem then, is silence connected to the corruption?
Yes, I don't know.
Yeah.
Please explain, ma'am.
Yeah, I'm trying to, it is a very broad question, and the way I understand it is one of the criticisms of postmodern writing is that it is playful. And that is the word that is often used, right? It doesn't like to take a stand, and therefore certain people who should have some kind of moral condemnation, you know, in good moral fiction where people who do bad things happen to them and the reader is satisfied. But postmodern writing often sometimes has satire, but it also allows people who are excessive, could be very corrupt, could be people who have some kind of perverse tendencies, etc., that it allows them to kind of also play, right? I don't personally have a problem with that, because I think one of the ways in which we test ourselves is writing is to read. You know, one of the things my father and my mother disagreed on was, my father said, well, whatever she is capable of reading and understanding, she should read. My mother didn't think that was a very good idea. She said, you should not be letting your daughter read these things. But my father's argument is, if I can understand what that is, then I should have the ability to read. Because in some way we find out who we are through our response to certain things. This is also why literature is a secret kind of mirror for ourselves, right? I don't believe literature indoctrinates, because it doesn't have the power. It's so contradictory, it doesn't have the power to indoctrinate. I think what it does is that it gives you these options to read. You can read a story this way, you can read a story this way, you can read a story this way. You can respond in a particular way to a corrupt character. But how you respond to that tells you something about yourself. And you might say, you know what, maybe I should change the way I think. This is why gender studies, sexuality studies, postcolonial studies, they all made us look differently. We had ignored certain things, but we didn't think we were ignoring anything, but our ways of reading didn't account for certain things. And once we understood that we were ignoring certain things, we shifted gears and we started noticing other things. So I would not condemn a postmodern novel for being playful, but I think it has a different role to play than the kind of role that we think, which is of creating ethical relationships for ourselves and for the people that we know. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. How many of you are familiar with something like postcolonial studies? Yeah. Or, yeah, okay, go ahead.
I would ask you in general about the Malayalam usages of words like Kumbham and Indonesia, as well as in Code of Small Things, we can see similar words like Malayalam words like usage of Amachi, Papachan, and all these words are tended to
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think there are different kinds of strategies that are used in translation, and when you translate something, I feel that there should be a lesson about language also communicated through the translation. So a good example is one of the very famous critics, postcolonial critics, is Gayatri Spivak, right? She is a Bengali, studied in India for till her bachelor's or her master's, and then she moved to she's famous because she was the person who introduced the US audience to Derrida's work. She was the first person who translated him, so that's why she's that famous. She translated the stories of Mashwata Devi from Bengali to English, and she did something really interesting. She left the sorts of words she italicized in the translation were words like police, encounter, government, etc. Her point was to say that these words were in Bengali in English. So when we Malayalis, even people who speak very fluent Malayalam suddenly use an English word, how do you communicate that when you translate it? You have to italicize that English word.
That's what
right?
I was asking about.
Yeah.
We can't translate the correct. We always used to call acha amma, and we can't get the emotion correct after translating it to other words or other language.
Yeah.
So I hope that the correct idea, which as a writer, if I write about my acha or amma, when it is getting translated to other language, the correct idea, what I meant, will not be given to the audience, right?
I know that that's always a problem, but there's so many interesting ways in which we can communicate at least the problem. If somebody realizes there's a problem in translation, that itself is a good lesson, is what I was saying, rather than spoon feeding everything like the way Abraham Varghese said, chatta is a white thing with a, munda is this with a fan at the back, it hides the bottom. That I felt was not making the reader do a little work, right? So another example is, this is controversial, where usually when you want to show slightly uneducated or village people talking and you translate it, what do? You make them speak bad English, right? Some kind of ungrammatical English. But that's really unfair to a rural person. The rural person may be saying something quite profound, but to make it sound like it's a rural person, you give them bad English, right? So that's one of the problems. So one of the things Mashwata Devi did was, she made the tribals speak in African American dialect, right? Which was kind of shocking, because they said, well, the tribal in Bengal doesn't speak like the African American in the US, the African American dialect. But her point was that I wanted to show that this was a minority dialect that was not perfectly understandable by the dominant Bengalis. So what I'm saying is, it's the texturizing of the language that communicated a problem and a relationship, rather than the actual words acha and amma. But I would leave acha and amma untranslated, make them go and do a Google search and find out what that means. That's what we were saying. Make the readers do a little work, because they have the tools now to do it. Right? Yeah. Good question. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
And even the English code, those are entire narratives in English. The author occasionally uses different languages, German, Italian, Spanish, to make it more powerful and impressive, and much more culturally contextualized.
This is the text you were talking about. How do you spell that? Yeah.
Da Vinci's Code.
Oh, Da Vinci Code. No, the other text that you were talking about, the Greek. Yeah. You can make comments also. They don't always have to be questions. And we tell our graduate students, we say, you know what? You have to ask a question. So if you've got nothing to ask, just say, tell me more about this. right? So that's also a kind of a question. But it's all part of being part of a public discourse. That I know these are things that we also need to train ourselves in, the moment of engaging in conversation. So I'm just lecturing you about that also, because I do this with my students. Yeah.
You have said that this spoon feeding is not necessary. Like, you can refer some Google resources to find the translation. Then who will read such a book that for every word or for every piece you want some Google resources, who found it, you can find it interesting.
Yeah, I don't think every word you would not succeed, right? But you would leave a few words, like the ones that you were saying, untranslated. Yeah, I didn't mean that then. Then it is not a translated book then if you leave like a lot of it, yeah. But I'm just saying that nowadays you can, there's so many resources that you can actually find the meaning of something, and why let the reader off the hook? I mean, when you look at Ngugi's work or Achebe's work, there was a time they would have a glossary at the back. That was the first generation writers. They would leave the words untranslated. And Ngugi was actually very particular about that. He wanted to leave, in fact, he stopped writing in English, if you remember. He started writing in his own language, Gikyu, because he said he didn't want to be promoting the death of his own language by writing in English. You would have 2 pages at the end where you could go and look up the words, etc. So it's working the same way. You would not have like many words, 5 or 6 pages, but you would have a few, yeah. Yes. I'll pick one too, yes. Go ahead.
I was also thinking the same thing she said, like,
All or nothing, too many words will,
if you use like a lot of native words,
yeah.
it will bring a larger audience to the book.
Yeah, I mean, this is a judgment you make as a writer, right? How much to use, when will it, and there are ways to use a word that conveys the meaning without actually translating the word. You can say what the chatta and munda is without saying it's a white piece of cloth with a fantail at the back, etc. Maybe the fantail could have been mentioned 5 pages later when somebody came and pulled the fantail or something. It's a different way of showing it. You don't have to translate it right there. That's all I was objecting to. So maybe I'm biased. Maybe I should ask my friends who don't know any Malayalam to go and read the first paragraph of. I will actually do that. I will assign that novel in my class where there are no Malayali kids. There's one Bengali guy. But for him, the problem will be the same thing. So I'll find out. What happened when you read that? I'm sure they're going to say, oh, we really liked it. It's a lot of texture, etc. Yeah. Anyway. So how many of you are worried that the study of literature, how many of you still feel, do any of you still feel, let me make it even narrower, that while you really enjoy studying literature, you like reading novels, you like, reading poetry, you like writing fiction or creative writing, that you think that this is not really useful, or it doesn't feel very connected to the rest of the world. It's some kind of a private activity, an activity that you share here in a room with people that you know and with your professors who love this stuff. Yes? See, I let you off the hook. I said all of you love literature, so your professors are not going to think that you don't like what you do. But is there a problem where you feel that you can't translate to other people? There was a time they say, English literature, yeah, English literature. But now you get a different reaction from people when you say, I'm studying English literature, as opposed to journalism, which makes sense because you get a job and it's proper. What do you think, Nubu? Have you taken the pulse of the students to answer that question?
These days, when other students, especially studying other streams in science, they are going abroad for having a lucrative job. But the students here feel that even after studying literature, which is connected to their life, why literature is not producing as many jobs as other streams? That is the concern among many students here. Maybe they are not asking. So, for example, if somebody is coming to study something in US, nobody is taking literature. Everybody is going for MBA, other things. Why literature is not producing that much of interest among students? Am I right? Yes.
Yeah, good. So I want you to find a way to defend yourself. Why are you doing this then? Do you want more job training? Do you want literature, the study of literature, to change in a way that you think you can be trained for other things? So one of the things that we have done for this reason, sometimes our students' parents come. Rice is a private university. It's expensive, costs a lot of money to send students there. Parents will come and say, my daughter wants to study, wants to be an English major. English major means you want to do a BA in English, 4 years, not 3 years, 4 years. But they also have to do science classes and all that. So, we're going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, and what kind of a job will this student get? And we are in the same position. It's, we don't expect everybody to go and teach literature. There was a time you took English literature to become an IAS officer, right? Because this was good. But one of the most popular fields for people who have done English literature is law. In fact, everyone who has done law in the US, I think 50% of them had degrees in English literature. So this is actually, and people finish a BA and then they go to law college. I don't know if it's here, it's the same thing. You go to law college after +2 or? Yeah. So that is seen as a field where the analytical training with language becomes really useful. And that's a real channel. The other thing we are seeing is technology companies are very much more interested in humanistic students, not to make chips and, to make, they don't want computer engineers. They want computer engineers for certain kinds of jobs. But in the end, most software that is being developed, etc., one of the things, and we have lots of Indian friends who are in the software industry, and my friend Tulsi works for a company in Austin, Texas. She says their meetings, when they want to sell a product, when they want to design a product, it is not the science people who necessarily describe the product, because the people who know what people want are the people who have the ability to analyze cultural trends. Would young people be interested in this kind of an app or this kind of a product or this kind of a software, etc.? That is not the scientist's job. That is the job of the people with much more social science and humanities background. And when they describe the product, she says, we have to tell a story. And I'm not kidding. She used the word story. The way you pitch the product in a company is to describe the product in terms of a story. how it will be used by people, etc. So I'm not saying that I would like my students to go and join software companies. All I'm saying is many of the skills that we teach our students are being used in many different kind of technological areas, especially in the digital era, right? My friend who does linguistics also does something called computational linguistics, so a little bit of interdisciplinary work. His job is to teach machines to recognize different accents, right? Because a linguist knows how to cut down speech into particular algorithmic, different kinds of sounds. And they need people like that when they're selling an ATM in a country in Africa or in Asia or Thailand or Malaysia. The speech recognition is something for which linguists are needed. So one of the things we've been trying to do in my department is to call in somebody who has a good awareness of the sorts of jobs that are out there for people with humanities backgrounds, right? And what she does is that she brings the students in a room and she says, so did you organize a colloquium? So some students who may have helped organize something like this, that's a skill. When you go into a job, you can say, I helped organize a seminar, right? I know how to do word processing. There are so many skills that you learn as an English literature person that you also need to know that these are skills that are useful in different kinds of jobs. So one of the things we've been trying to do is acknowledge that our students may end up in different professions and to help them write their biodatas in ways that will make them qualified for many more jobs, right? So I know this is not an easy fix, but I'm sure you're thinking about this also institutionally, about how we can better help students find jobs and careers where they don't have to give up a lot of what they have learned some way. But the other thing is this, right? And we learned this from two of the very famous engineers who've given the most money to Rice University's humanities programs, including English literature. 3 professors in my department, their salaries are being paid by an engineer who graduated from Rice in the 60s, went to Silicon Valley, became a big venture capitalist, and started all these startup companies. When he comes and talks, sometimes he comes to Rice University and gives a talk. One of them talks all the time about poetry, right? And the other one talks about how in his profession as a venture capitalist, he has tried to give startup money. These are all billionaires. Startup money to people from less enfranchised communities, women entrepreneurs, minority entrepreneurs, etc. And he says his social consciousness came from the study of humanities, philosophy and English mostly, right? But one of the things, so one is that it trains your mind. I know that it doesn't translate immediately into money or getting a job, but for those of you who are going to probably live, hopefully with all the new medical technologies into your 90s, maybe you'll all live to 100, unlike some of us who have not been very good about taking care of themselves. Remember that your work life will end and there will be decades where you have to do something with your life. And that is where your love for writing, your love for reading, your love for learning is going to become really, really important. And that is what these billionaires were trying to tell us, that there is a part of them that has learned from studying poetry and studying philosophy that has enhanced and made their lives much more rich as venture capitalists in the technology field. So, it's not useful to tell 20-year-olds that, hey, this will be very useful for you when you turn 80. I don't mean that. But I'm just saying that it cannot be quantified very easily, what you have learned and what you've been trained and how your mind notices details. But it is a skill that will help you in whatever you do, I think. Anyway. Yes?
Currently, there are now 100 more leads in that company. So from the lab,
So, did I encounter, yeah, actually, I don't know if this answers your question, but I'll say this. One of the most exciting things for me was to go and, well, I didn't even know that these records were there, but somebody had donated these factory records to University of Minnesota had a South Asia library, and there was a man who was obsessed with India, so he used to collect everything. So one professor told me, you know what? You know that there is all these East India Company records. So I said, no, I mean, I didn't. So I went and just looked at, they said factory records, yeah? Factory St. George, Anjengo, etc. And I said Anjengo. So I just pulled one up, and it began to, I noticed that it was a factory in Kerala, right? And these are records from like 1687, 1714, there was, breaks and things. And then as I read, it became really fascinating because you had a record, they used to keep such detailed records of everything, including the washerwoman coming and complaining that nobody had paid her money from the factory, or that the queen has demanded gifts. And suddenly the whole history of who owned the pepper, you think, why was the pepper in the hands of the Travancore Rani? Why did she have the power over pepper, and why was the king in some way hampered because he did? Suddenly I began to understand my history in a way that I had never seen or heard because I studied in the north. Indian history doesn't even come even close to anywhere. Tipu Sultan and that's it. There is no Kerala anywhere in Indian history thing. Suddenly it was like I could identify places like Telisheri, etc. in these old records. And for me it was like coming to my own roots in a different way. That was what was so exciting. And the knowledge that nobody had read this stuff. A couple of historians had read this stuff, but they had looked at it generally. No one had read it like a literary critic would do. Who's writing to whom? How long is it taking? Why is this woman complaining? Why is this woman complaining to someone saying the cornucopia of the warehouse has assaulted her? I said, cornucopia, I don't even know this word. And it took me 3 years to find out that the word is actually kanakapalla. Right? So some of it was just this kind of a learning, and I felt much closer in some way to my history through reading those records in this kind of detailed way. I would spend like days sometimes just reading 2 letters to see what was going on in them. So it was one of the most exciting. That book I really enjoyed writing. This book, not so much, because globalization, who feels excited about globalization? But historical work for a literary critic is just like deciphering, and we have a different kind of skill of reading it in a way that often historians do not, and that was what was useful in some way for me. So, I mean, ideally, one would want to look at the Malayalam records here, but who can do that, right? That's even harder. Somebody like Dr. Pius will, and you will go and ask him about those. But yes, I mean, that's one of the reasons I'm so looking forward to conversation. I want to do more of this work, and now I feel I have the time and the resources, because I realize, you have limited time, you have limited resources, you cannot do all this right now. But if you choose to go into a research area, there is lots to be done. It's not simply reading the same novels and poetry all over again. There's so many different ways in which we can use literary criticism, especially in historical, reading historical documents and historical work. And now I want to go and read this Charisha. Exciting. Is it translated? Then I read about Vartamana Pustakam. 18th century travel narrative. I found it's already translated in English. 2 priests journeying all the way to Rome to complain about the Portuguese. Uh-huh. I mean, fascinating stuff. I would have never known this till, I got into 18th century studies. So you come back with a different perspective on Kerala in some way. Yes.
Thank you for your views. And my question is that is this digital age fostering the colonialism in a different way? Like cyber colonialism. Recently I saw a term called cyborton.
What is that?
Cyborton means the subaltern.
Oh, subaltern.
Yeah,
Oh,
subaltern.
subaltern.
In the cyber colonialist world, it seems that the sideline is termed as cyborton. And we can see many examples which, if you see the advertisement of Imperial Blue, yeah, you see the word men will be men. So it's a feminist thing.
Which one? Imperial?
Imperial Blue is a brand, a Western brand.
Ah.
And the quote or the tagline is men will be men.
What is it? What kind of a product is
There
it?
is a patriarchal connotation to that.
Yeah.
An anti-feminist tagline like,
Overcoat. Ah.
yeah.
Yeah.
Or we see complete man. Like many quotes which foster this anti-feminist activities. So for me, this digital age is actually fostering the colonial dominance in a different way. Now we are living in an artificial intelligent world, and if this artificial intelligence is rather an imperial intelligence, if it is a colonial intelligence, we see the logo of ChatGPT, where it is a mixture of white and black. So we can just compare it with the black skin and white mask. That lines in the ChatGPT may refer to the black skin, and the whole white background may refer to the white mask. So through these AI technologies and AI paradigms, might this colonial dominance will be fostering in a different way?
Yeah, I think people have, well, one is how much English has gained in speaking, how much English has become dominant since the internet, right? Because a lot of it is still accessible in English. So one is that the global English has become even more hegemonic. Minority languages will find it less and less able to compete.
We see the Muslims being misrepresented in the Hollywood
Yeah,
film,
yeah, yeah.
the Middle East.
Well, or the damage that WhatsApp is doing with messaging and creating hatred among people, all these. But in the US, it is all about bullying. And a lot of it is young girls in schools who are committing suicide because somebody ganged up against them and 10 people unfriended them one day. So now they're seeing young girls whose, to be on social media, Instagram, is to have 50 mirrors looking at you, right? Cognitively, you're still unformed, you're vulnerable, but parents who don't know better are giving access to their children to be on all these social media things. Schools are promoting more and more learning with laptops, so you can't police them. Nowadays, all children have phones because parents need to know where they are, right? So we are also in a structure where we are now forced to use this technology. I mean, how many parents don't want to give their children phones because they want to know where they are? Then you want to figure out how to censor them so they don't use the phone for other things, right? So I don't know if it's colonial in the sense that it is controlled anymore by the US or by Britain or anything. But I think it is corporate in some way, right? More than colonial it is. And I don't know, I don't know enough to know what the solutions are to these things. One of the things I do is in my classes I say I don't want you to use electronic novels. But after 2 weeks, they'll all have their paper. One day one student will come in and start reading the novel on the phone. Oh, I forgot my novel in my dormitory. So what do? You can't throw the student out of the class. You can't do those kinds of things. So you get a little annoyed with the student. But it comes back. Then there are people who say, why are you wasting paper? Right? I don't want my students to have printout, so then say, okay, well, do use the PDF back on your laptops now. So, we find ourselves trying to do something different by making them go back offline to do, but their handwriting is so bad now that then some students feel like they're being unfairly marked down because their handwriting is bad, because touching all the time. So we're kind of trapped in this. But I think the question is also, how do you teach people to read in a way that they can discriminate between things that are fake? I am stunned by how many of my relatives who I thought were educated, intelligent people, how they're forwarding stuff that is complete nonsense.
We live in a post-truth era.
Yeah. And then I wonder, is there something about your education as a doctor or an engineer that didn't allow you to tell the difference between something that is true and fake? I really believe that a lack of humanistic education is making it harder for people to tell what is true. Because they don't have a way to find out. We can find out if something is fake or true by comparison and, by comparing and contrasting it with other. But they don't know how to look for it. So those
The
are...
education system is giving us fake news. How can the children or the students
Yeah.
discriminate? Recently we saw that the issue with plastic surgery being compared with Ganapati. Ganapati is the first evidence of the first, but the instance of plastic surgery. Or Karnan is the first instance of stem cell, IVF. Or Pushpaga Viman is the first instance of the modern flight. It is not the right to this.
Right.
So these are the things or the curriculum that is being made by the new government. So the student is not able to discriminate between.
Well, it's also the dominance of the technocrat, right? Why is it that you have to find science in your ancient books? Why can't you just let them be narratives, spiritual narratives, cultural narratives, historical narratives? No, you have to make them scientific documents. So it's a technocrat that is also now trying to, demolish, I think, the status of these things. Bombs, flying planes, it's all technology. It's like technology is what makes us important, gives us, abhimanam as a third world country or something. Yeah, it's a very warped, that is colonial thinking. That is colonial thinking.
And with respect to the use of regional languages, I think it is good or we should use more regional languages or colloquial, vernacular languages. Because if we see a word like Walton Shaw or word vision,
Yeah,
we will surely look into what is the meaning of the word.
yeah,
If you see res cogitan, res
Yeah.
extensa,
Right.
or
yeah,
cogito ergo sum.
exactly.
So we will not just what the fuck like
Yeah.
that, but we will surely look into its meaning. So like kanji, appachan, papachan,
Yeah.
the Western world should
Yeah.
look into its meaning.
Exactly, yeah.